Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Teacher David Ouko Nyaberi. In our class today, we're going to focus on the first topic of Form 3, that is history and government. The topic is European invasion of Africa and the process of colonization. Now, as we discussed in Form 1, we talked about various early visitors who came to Africa. Among them were the Portuguese, the British, the Romans, the Arabs, and many others. Now, when these Europeans came into Africa, they carried out many activities, including trade, carrying out activities such as Western education, establishing health centers, and many others. Now, as these people were carrying out these activities, the major activity that opened the interior of Africa to European colonization was trade. Now, trade was one of the activities that opened the interior of Africa to European colonization. Now, in this topic, we're going to look at various ways that the Europeans used to invade Africa and partition it. We are also going to look at various impacts of the European invasion of Africa and the process of partition. Now, before we focus on those areas, we start by looking at the definition of the term scramble. Now, scramble is the first thing that we have to look at. Now, scramble is defined to be the rush for the African regions by the European powers. Now, these European powers were struggling. Now, they were rushing for, or they were struggling. Now, let's say it was the rush for or the struggle among the European powers. To obtain African regions. Now, when the Europeans arrived in Africa, each European nation was struggling in order to obtain a certain part or region of Africa. Now, that's the definition of the term scramble. Now, let's move forward and look at the other definition, which is partition. Partition. Now, partition was the dividing or the sharing of African regions amongst the European powers. Now, when the Europeans arrived in Africa, they shared or they divided African regions amongst themselves in order to control them. Now, that's the definition of the term partition. Now, moving forward, we'll focus on the various methods that were used by the Europeans to acquire colonies. Now, that's the other part that we're going to focus on. Now, when the Europeans came to Africa, they used various means and difficult methods or ways in order to acquire some colonies in Africa. Number one, we're going to look at the signing of treaties. The signing of treaties. Now, the Europeans signed various treaties as they were acquiring colonies in Africa. And one of the types of treaties that was signed is the treaties between Africans and Europeans. There were treaties that were signed by some African leaders and the Europeans in order to agree on the various areas or territories that the Europeans would occupy. Another type of treaty that was signed was the Partition treaties. The Partition treaties. These were the agreements that were signed amongst the Europeans when they clashed over a given region. Now, we'll look at various examples of these treaties that were signed between the Africans and Europeans and the Partition treaties. And now, one example of the treaties that were signed between the Africans and the Europeans was the treaty signed between King Lobengula of Matabeleland. There's treaty signed between King Lobengula of Matabeleland and the British South African Company. That's one of the examples of a treaty that was signed between the Africans and the Europeans. Another one was that of Kabaka Mwanga of Buganda. And the Imperial British East Africa Company. Now, those are some of the examples of the treaties that were signed between the Africans and the Europeans. Now we'll move forward and look at the example of a treaty of Partition treaties. That is the second treaty that was signed. Now we look at the two examples of Partition treaties that were signed, which are the Anglo-German Treaty of 1896 and 1890. Now, those are the two examples of the Partition treaties that were signed amongst the Europeans. Now, after looking at one of the methods always that were used by the Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa, we focused on signing. So the other method that was used by the Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa is the use of treaty. Now, this is whereby the Europeans were tricking Africans with presents. Now, the Europeans, when they came to Africa, they could trick the African rulers with presents such as clothes, beads, and alcohol, so that they could sign treaties. Now, that's another method that was used by the Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa. Now, let's move and look at another method, which is divide and rule. the divide and rule policy. Now, this is whereby the Europeans were playing one community against the other. And now, when the communities could be weakened, now the Europeans could come in and take over their territories. Now, this is whereby the Europeans were playing on one community against each other. Now, when the communities could fight, they will become weakened. Now, therefore, the Europeans will get a chance of coming into their territory. Now, moving forward, another method is the use of military conquest. The use of military conquest. Now, this is whereby the Europeans were using their own military forces. Now, this is the use of military forces. In order to acquire colonies in Africa. Now, the Europeans could invite their own troops to rebel the communities that were resisting against their occupation of Africa. Now, that is another method that was used by the Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa. Now, at our comment section, one may add another method or a way that the Europeans used to acquire colonies in Africa.